Award-winning novelist, literary and art critic, screenwriter, director and producer, raconteur, genius, and a very nice man. Teacher, playwright, wit and champion of the humble British CAF, William Boyd, too little known and regarded by the general public. His loyal readers were hooked when his first novel, A Good Man in Africa, won the Whitbread Award and Somerset Maugham Prize, and he is perhaps best known for his epic whole-life story, the romantic drama Any Human Heart, which artfully weaves real-life characters like Ian Fleming and the Duke of Windsor into an epic work of fiction, a device which has startled the literary world. It's called making things up, the author bashfully reflects. What's less well known is his attachment to film projects. Few realise he wrote the original screenplay of Richard Attenborough's Chaplin, where he befriended actor Robert Downey Jr. He was a writer of the BAFTA award-winning Channel 4 dramatisation of Any Human Heart and directed his own powerful art house war film, The Trench. A huge expert of modern art, he famously once invented the artist Nat Tate in cahoots with David Bowie, as a joke on the art establishment. The accompanying autobiography exploited Will's love of found photographs and a fascination which has found its way into his innovative novel, Sweet Caress. This evokes his earlier epics, The New Confessions and Any Human Heart. Will is writing once again as a thoroughly believable female character. This followed an invitation by the Fleming Foundation to write the best of all the Bond novels solo, arguably including those written by Fleming himself, which features his recipe for vinaigrette, a recipe which has 8-year-old children begging for more salad. His father, Dr. Alexander Boyd, practicing at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, became the role model for a doctor in Will's debut novel, A Good Man in Africa, a novel which he sold to publisher Hamish Hamilton before he'd actually written a word of it. There followed 2 weeks of frantic activity, passed off as rewrites, before the book was delivered. In 2018, we talked to the author more about his experiences as a novelist and screenwriter.
My breakfast was extremely unexciting this morning. I had half a banana and a slice of toast with marmalade and a cup of tea, no milk, no sugar. My father was quite communicative about his various strange medical problems that he encountered, but I was incredibly squeamish, so I never asked him any questions. The house was full of medical textbooks, and as an adolescent boy, of course, you might be flicking through these, educating yourself, and I never did because the images in them were so horrible. So I think there's an element of my father in the various doctors I've had in my fictions. But he died young. He was only 58 when he died, and I was in my mid-20s. And so it's his ghost, if you like, his shade that's influenced me rather than anything I actually picked up at the time. A fridge is an amazingly efficient place to store anything precious. Apparently at Hiroshima, they found this blackened, scorched fridge, and they opened it up and they found 6 eggs inside. Hence the idea that if you want to store something and your house burns down, the fridge is the best place. But I don't keep stuff in the fridge anymore because I've got a computer. And this is the pre-computer age we're talking about, because I write in longhand. For a while, there was only one copy of the novel I was writing. But now every day or every second day, I type it up onto a computer. It's saved umpteen times, so I'm more relaxed. The period of, I call it the period of invention, followed by a period of composition. And I do write a tremendous amount, actually. I fill notebooks. I make all my mistakes in that period before I've started actually writing the novel. And the aim of this, 2 years or so of thinking and sometimes traveling, of accumulating a library that would be useful for me, of collecting photographs, etc., is really all aiming towards establishing the ending of the novel, the destination. And once I know how the novel ends, then I can start writing it. And it's very good advice. I give it all the time. It's often ignored, but a good ending can save a mediocre novel, and a bad ending can ruin a good novel. So when people say to me, I've got a great idea for a novel, or a film, or a television series, or whatever, I always say, how does it end? And invariably they say, well, I haven't thought of that yet. And my advice is think of the ending and work back, and you might be okay. So that's what I do in this long period of gestating. I research, I make notes, I can do a very detailed chapter list. I basically can write a sort of outline of the novel, but I'm hoping that the end will come to me. And once that's there, then I can start. Screenplays take much less time than a novel. How long is a screenplay? 100 pages on average, lots of blank spaces, probably a chapter of a novel in terms of actual words written down. Of course, you're telling a story and there's a narrative there, but it takes me roughly 3 years to invent and write a novel. But I have written a script in a week. So it's a different, I've always said this is a totally different art form, and its demands are different, and the time spent on it can be long. If you're in writing an original script, you have to research it. It's a bit like writing a novel. But what takes the time is the development and the endless notes you get from executives that you have to somehow incorporate in your various drafts. And so a screenplay can take longer than a novel, paradoxically, before it gets made. But you're not working on it in the same way. It's a craft, I think, not an art. I think that people are opaque and mysterious, and one of the great powers of the novel is that it actually explains other people to us better than our own life experiences do. If you want to know what makes people tick, read a novel. And actually, all the ambiguities and uncertainties of human behavior are kind of resolved in a novel because, paradoxically, they're all true because somebody made them up and can vouch for them. So I think that these ideas of different identities of people occupying different selves, which I happen to believe anyway. I don't think we're the same person all the way through our life. I think we do change, and our experiences, good and bad, make us different people. Are a result of my life experiences, but in the fictional experience, I can nail them down much more effectively. When it comes to book jackets, because I fancy that, or I pride myself on having some ideas about aesthetics and design, unlike many novelists, covers are very important to me, and I couldn't actually tolerate a novel of mine if I didn't like the cover. And in my contracts, I have a veto, but I'm trying to make sure the covers work. And one of the things I obsess about is typeface. The other thing is that if you put a person's face on the cover of the book, the reader automatically will identify that face with the character in the novel. So I've always insisted that the face is cropped or shadowed in some way, so that you can't make that easy identification. You can't say, oh, this young woman on the cover of Brasville Beach must be Hope Clearwater. I like to keep that. I like to let the reader, contribute his or her understanding of the character, because it is a joint effort, a novel, a unique relationship, and so the reader doesn't want to know that John James Todd or Logan Mount Stewart looks like the photograph of that guy on the cover. So that's another one of my bugbears, and so far so good. I don't think anyone's ever been identified yet. I've just seen the cover for the new novel, the paperback cover, and one of them has a picture of a young woman. It's a fantastic picture, but I said, look, everyone will think that's Lika Bloom, and so I think we're going to go with a cropped face again, just so you can't make that identification. Chimpanzees were believed to be benign, happy primates. And one of the things that stimulated Brazzaville Beach was this discovery that by Jane Goodall, who's one of the most famous primatologists, that in fact chimpanzees committed genocide on other chimpanzee tribes, and not only wiped them out, but wiped them out with gratuitous cruelty. And what it showed me was actually that chimps are incredibly close to human beings when it comes to evil and violence. I think the interesting thing about the novel and cinema is that every cinematic technique that we take for granted today was actually present in the novel before cinema was invented. So extreme close-ups, parallel action, slow motion, cross-cutting, was all there in Madame Bovary, for example, and the Lumiere brothers hadn't yet arrived on the scene. So in fact, the techniques of the novel influenced cinema far more than vice versa. And I think the novel has always been very visual anyway. People sometimes say to me, oh, your novel's very cinematic, but I say, no, they're very novelistic. And so if there's been any influence at all on my screenwriting, it's come from my novel writing, because, again, they're two vastly different art forms, and the novel offers you unlimited, generous freedom, and film offers you a world of compromise and parameters, because it's photography. It sounds banal, but it's what determines you can do. Whereas in a novel, you can do absolutely anything. And Brazzaville Beach, with its 2 time scales, I changed pronouns from I to she. There's a kind of editorial presence of somebody commenting about maths on the action. Just an example of the novel's total freedom to fracture narrative, to play around with structure. You couldn't film Brazzaville Beach in the way I've written it. Pedro Almodovar actually wanted to make a film of Brazzaville Beach, believe it or not, but it would have been a far simpler story, and all the complexities and the freedoms of the novel just couldn't have been in the film. Well, photographs have been used in novels for quite a long time. I mean, Virginia Woolf used photographs in a novel, for example, and W.G. Sebald, for example, more recently has made a point of using photographs in a novel, but they've only used 8 or 10. I had 73 photographs in Sweet Caress, which I think is a record, and I was astonished that people took it for granted, as if it's the most normal thing in the world. And they were all anonymous photographs, and some of them were of people who were in the novel, but some of them were also examples of photographs that I said Amory had taken. And it was all an attempt to make the novel seem so real that you would doubt its fictionality, another thing that I constantly do. And of course I had used photographs in Nat Tate as well, so it was taking the Nat Tate experiment to another degree. But it's funny, readers don't comment on it, and critics didn't really comment on it either. So maybe it wasn't as innovative as I thought it was. I'm about to draw a new Nat Tate as a wedding present for our niece. Occasionally, somebody moves house or a godchild gets married, and I find another Nat Tate in the attic. I think I've done about over 20 Nat Tates now over the years, and I keep a record of who has them, because I think a couple of instances where I think people have tried to forge them. But I know exactly who has the Nat Tates, and on the back of every Nat Tate I do, there is a letter of authentication signed by me. So it'd be very easy if somebody rocked up to Christie's or Sotheby's saying, I've got a Nat Tate. I could very easily verify if it was a fraud or the real thing. So I will carry on producing the odd Nat Tate from time to time, and I have 5 actually at home hanging in the hall. So there's quite a body of work now. Well, I think the idea of pursuit is actually very common in novels, and it's a wonderful motor, if you like, for the narrative, a chase or somebody fleeing. I think in my case it's slightly more complicated than that, because another thing I realised looking back is that I often take a character from somewhere quite secure or somewhere they're familiar with and plonk them down somewhere they're unfamiliar with, and therefore they become tested. They have to fall back on their own resources as individuals, and I do it time and again. Even a novel like Stars and Bars, for example, ends with the character Henderson Dawes being pursued by a crazed redneck gunman. So it's I think that almost implies what happens next, but it's more a question of removing the character from his or her comfort zone and seeing how they cope, and a pursuit or jeopardy or flight in a way allows me to do that very easily. But it's all, in the new novel Love is Blind, it's a very common trope in Scottish literature, the demonic pursuit. If you think of the famous novel Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg, there's a brother figure who's pursuing the central character. So I wanted to nod to these traditions as well, but I recognize that I do it all the time. But it's more to, as I say, it's more to put my characters under stress and see how they behave. Well, I think I move between the recent past and the present. I've written quite a few short stories that are set in the present. For example, the Bethany Melmoth stories are all about a young girl in London today. So I think there's a lot of present day in my fiction. The problem with writing something that's absolutely contemporary is it has a built-in obsolescence, and it can very quickly date, who won Strictly Come Dancing last year. I rather disparagingly call it Mars Bar School of Writing, because you put in references that seem to you to be entirely recognizable and commonplace, but in 10 years' time you'll need a footnote to explain them. So in fact it's more common and it's more natural for novelists to write slightly in the past, because everything is fixed there, the types of cars, the movies you saw, the clothes you wore, the food you ate is fixed, and politicians and political events and historical events have had all their ramifications explored. If you set something absolutely today, you may find yourself with egg all over your face when Brexit is reversed, for example. So I think you look at great novels. George Eliot wrote Middlemarch. It was set 30 years before she wrote it. James Joyce wrote Ulysses in the 1920s. It's set in the very beginning of the 20th century. It's quite common for novelists to go a decade or two back. And I think that also for me, the 20th century, I was born in the middle of the 20th century. My grandmother was born in the late 1880s. So I knew somebody very well who was born in the 19th century and who was a Victorian. So it doesn't seem to me to be ancient history. I mean, if I wrote a novel set in the 16th century, that would be another matter. But writing a novel that goes, say, 3 generations back doesn't seem to me to be that odd. I mean, my great uncle was wounded at the Battle of the Somme. My grandfather was wounded at the Battle of Passchendaele. My grandmother and my grandfather went on their honeymoon to Brussels in 1895 or something. So that's when Love is Blind starts, 1894, in fact. So I knew people who were alive then. So it seems to me to be part of the present in a way. And I don't have any problem about that. But technically speaking, it's advantageous to go just a little bit back in time, and you save yourself a lot of hassle. The piece of music in Love is Blind is a Scottish folk song. I sort of know what the tune is because I was thinking of a piece of bluegrass music that I love, which was sung by Alison Krauss, a wonderful bluegrass singer, loosely based, or the lyrics of which were loosely based on a poem that Robert Louis Stevenson wrote. But the words of the folk song that I quote in the novel were made up by me as my verses. But I haven't really got a tune playing in my head, to be honest. Names are incredibly important, and I think that as a tip, again, I offer this advice to younger writers, you shouldn't call your character, Sally Brown or Martin Foster, because perfectly good names though they are, because they're not sort of living or vivid in any way. So I always think you should give your characters names with a little bit of edge. You don't need to go the full Dickensian route, Mrs. Tiggywinkle or whatever. But if you give your characters a slightly odd name, they're already living and breathing on the page, I think. And that includes very minor characters. People just walk on and walk off. So I collect names and I take great care to name every character in a way that is somehow individual. John Todd is a rather boring name, but if he's called John James Todd, suddenly you remember his name. And I think it's true of all the characters I've used, with the exception of James Bond, very boring name. I think a lot about how to christen them. And this includes characters who are foreign, whether they're German or French or Italian or whatever. I try to get an interesting Italian name or an interesting French name as well. And I think it makes them come alive. And I think I will never change that particular practice. It's a very, very good tip, I think. I've got masses of names. I write them down. I was writing down names the other day that come from medieval professions, like Cordwainer and Fletcher and Thatcher, and because people were called after the job they used to do, and some of them are very odd names, but they're actually very historically right for a certain type of English person. So I just jot them down in my notebook and save them for the next novel. And but it's very important, I think. And if I didn't like the name of my central character, I don't think I could write the novel happily. And, I'm often criticized, or critics often say, what odd names. But usually these critics have very odd names themselves. And I think if you're in a world where somebody called Henry Dent Brocklehurst can marry a woman called Lily Maltese, and they're real people, I haven't even come close to that. So I won't apologize for 1 second for my naming. Chaplin was a complicated film because I was the first writer of the film was Brian Forbes, who I became very fond of and close to. But Forbes' script was not accepted by the studio, which was Universal in Hollywood. And so Universal said to Dickie Attenborough, you have to start again. And that's when I was approached. And so I didn't rewrite Brian Forbes' script. His script was never used. And so I wrote a new script of Chaplin for Dickie Attenborough to shoot. And it was a very expensive film for its time. It was the mid-90s. It was a $45 million film, so I don't know, $150 million today. The Universal, we were on the point of starting to film it. Robert Downey had been cast, and then Universal pulled out. They said it was too expensive. And so this happens all the time in the film industry. But only Dickie Attenborough could have set it up again. And he did set it up again at another studio, a mini major called Carol Co. And the executives at Carol Co, in their wisdom, decided that Chaplin's later years should be addressed, because I stopped the film, I think, in 1958 when he was kicked out of America and he wasn't allowed back in. That seemed to me a very good end, but they wanted his Switzerland years addressed. And so by then my contract with Universal had run out, and so Dickie approached William Goldman, who he'd worked with before, paid him to write the Switzerland scenes. The writer, and I would say this, wouldn't I, is actually the most important person in a film. Let's say, slicing up the cake, at least 60% of the film is the writer. Maybe the actors, 20, the directors, has his or her portion. But Hollywood has tried to tame writers' power by setting one against the other, and the whole process of rewriting is a way of diluting the power of the writer. Luckily, Chaplin wasn't too diluted, I think, by Goldman's scenes. I mean, he was just hired to do a job, and he did it. But it was the studio who demanded these scenes, and they were shot and put in the film. And I think the film actually stands on its own 2 feet, and is a very, sounds like faint praise, but it's not, a very interesting film, and probably the most daring film that Dickie Attenborough made in his career. Very unusual for him to make a film about somebody he revered, but who had, very obvious feet of clay. The Trench is an interesting film, and in a way, as time goes by, it becomes more interesting. I wanted to make a film about the First World War, which obsesses me, and I wanted it to be super accurate. We took enormous pains to get everything right. From the badges on the caps to the state of the trenches in July 1916, everything was scrupulously accurate. And one of the things I wanted to do was to have no stars in the film. And I achieved that. The only thing that's happened is they've since become enormous stars. But actually, at the time, when I cast Daniel Craig, he wasn't well known at all. Ben Whishaw, it was his very first film. He was doing his A-levels. Cillian Murphy, I think, had made one little film in Ireland. Danny Dyer had yet to take over the pub in EastEnders. Julian Rhind-Tutt, James Darcy, all these guys have gone on to have fantastic careers, and they owe it all to me, of course. But they were unknowns at the time. And the most famous actor in it was Paul Nicholls, who had just come out of EastEnders. And that slightly worried me, because I didn't watch EastEnders. I didn't know how famous he was. But they were all unknowns at the time. So when you saw the film, when it was released in 1999, none of those faces would make you say, oh gosh, he's the guy in X or Y. But the film has a kind of slightly mythic status, because all these people were in it when they were starting out or at the very beginnings of their career, and are now, stellar, shining bright film stars. But the film was, it cost £1 million. It was an art house war movie. It was a fascinating experience for me to do. It got a release in the UK. It got released art house release in America. It played in European. I went to film festivals with it. You can still buy it on DVD 20 years later. It has a DVD life. So knowing the nature of the business, for me, it was actually quite successful. Nobody got rich, but the film is still out there, and every now and then it pops up on television. And so it has a life, and that's the thing that, in a way, as a novelist, troubles me slightly about television and film, is that sometimes it can seem ephemeral. If you missed it on the night, it's gone forever. And somehow you want the films you've written to have the same kind of longevity as the books you've written, but it's not that easy. But so I look back at The Trench, and I'm still very friendly with the cast. I learned a tremendous amount. I think it's a good film. There are things I do differently now, but as a portrait of the reality of trench life in World War I, which was in a way my main ambition, I don't think it can be faulted. Filmmakers, it's very hard to say, because I think I'm not really a believer in the auteur theory, because I've worked on films so much, and it is a true collaboration, and I don't think anybody, even the writer, should have their name as it's called, the possessory credit, a film by, and so there are some films that I love because of the acting, and there are some films I love because of the directing. There are some films I love because of the writing, and there are films that somehow worm their way into your subconscious for reasons you can't really explain. Quentin Tarantino calls them hangout films. You think, what should we watch? And you think, well, let's watch that one again, and you can't understand. But I think that, one of my favorite films of top 10, top 5 is Chinatown, for example. Now, that's not because of Roman Polanski's direction, but it may be because of the incandescent beauty of Faye Dunaway, who's never been better, I think. Or it may be because it's an original screenplay. It's not an adaptation, and it's written by Robert Towne, and it's of all the screenplays that have been written, Roman Polanski, really did Robert Towne proud with that adaptation, except he changed the ending. And Polanski and Bob Evans, who was the executive at Paramount when they made it, thought Robert Towne's ending was wrong, and he didn't agree with them, but they overruled him. And the ending of Chinatown, now, which we have now, is actually Polanski and Bob Evans's idea, and actually it's fantastically good. I've seen Robert Towne's original screenplay, and his ending is too sentimental, and Polanski and Bob Evans's ending is utterly bleak, and of course it fits the story so well. So who gets the biggest slice of the cake there? I don't know. It's for me, it's there are all sorts of filmmakers I like, but they're in all different categories. For example, the film of the spy who came in from the cold is a very sort of doggedly faithful adaptation of the book. Directed, with competence, but it's Richard Burton who makes that film absolutely live on in your memory. It's an absolutely sensational performance. And so is it because is Richard Burton in a way the key creative force in that film, rather than Le Carré, the original writer, or I can't remember who wrote the screenplay, or the director? So it's again and again you realize that film is the work of many hands. I had a great friend called Jim Clark, who's a film editor, known as Dr. Clark because he could make sick films well again. And he worked a lot with John Schlesinger, who I also knew, and knew John. And John had just finished shooting Midnight Cowboy, and it was a complete and utter mess. And he rang Jim and said, "Can you come into the editing suite in New York, or wherever he was cutting it, and see if you can fix my film?" And Jim did, and John won an Oscar, and so did Dustin Hoffman. And Jim's credit on the film is creative consultant. It's not even credited as a film editor, but he recut the film. He added the Harry Nilsson song, "Everybody's Talking." You know, you can't think of Midnight Cowboy without that music. So, you know, who's the creative power in that film? And this is the editor in this case, not the director. But fantastic performances from Hoffman and John Voight, of course. So I think the possessory credit is iniquitous. Everybody deserves the credit they have, whether they're actors, directors, writers, editors, art directors, composers. It is a curious alchemy that goes to making a film work, and I don't think anyone should claim, you know, the top role in that. It can be very subtle, and often the person who seems to have the least credit on the film is the one who deserves the most. Television is in a very good state, I think, because all the good work is being done in television. It's one of these step changes, paradigm shifts that's going on, in that there are two types of films: enormously bloated $350 million films, and little art house films at the other end that cost $5 million. And in between, all the films that used to fill in that gap are now on television, it seems to me. And I would say that 70% of the work I'm offered now, commissioned work, is television, and it's far more interesting than the work I would be offered in the movie business. There is a problem in that there are these giant beasts out there, you know, Netflix, Amazon, Apple, Google, you know, all wanting to make product, as they call it, and you just can't watch it all. It's just, in a way, too much good drama out there. I was just talking to a film critic earlier today, and he thinks it's all going to turn sour because the more money that's pumped into long-form television, the blander it will become. And what is risky and edgy now, and what you can get away with because these giant corporations will be paying for it, will start to take everything that's edgy out and make some sort of bland pabulum to serve up to the viewing population. Who knows? It's definitely a time of change. It's probably never been better for filmmakers. And there's a lot of work out there, and you're given much more freedom than you are in the movie business. So it's a bit of a boom time, but we all know booms end and then there's bust. So we'll see. But certainly in my experience, in recent years, I have done all my work for these streaming services or foreign television companies, and I'm not working for the networks anymore, BBC, ITV, Channel 4. I'm working with Amazon and ZDF in Germany and E1, other companies like that. So as a writer, writing film, writing television, or television drama, it's a really good time to be around, because the jobs I'm doing are really interesting and challenging, some of them adaptations of my own novels. But they have to be made at the end of the day, and that's another issue. But it's certainly a good time to be in the creative end of the filmmaking process, I think. Well, every writer has, or every screenwriter has this kind of parallel universe where their much loved and nurtured projects actually got made and were realized. But it's a very fickle business, and I have at least 3 or 4 projects that I wish had been made, and that I think would have been good, but economic circumstances or personnel changes made it impossible. I'm lucky in the sense that it's not the only thing I do, so I can recycle all this material one way or another with a bit of luck. But there are, I've probably written 70 or 80 screenplays over the year, over 30 odd years, and I've had 18 made, some of them short films as well. So that's quite a good hit rate in the business. But there are 2 or 3 that got away that I would have loved to have seen. Some of them are a bit moribund, others are showing more signs of life. And I think the 2 in particular that may actually be made early next year. One is based on one of my short stories called Cork, which is a little art house film which we'll film in and around Lisbon, and set in the 1930s, of a very, very strange love affair. And the other one is an original script, a series of scripts at 6 hours of television called Spy City, which is set in Berlin in 1961, in the months before the Berlin Wall goes up, when Berlin was an open city to a degree, had 4 armies in it, Russian, French, British and American, and of course hoaching with spies, hence the title. And so I've come up with a spy thriller that is to do with the Berlin Wall and to do with that kind of... It was the focal point of the Cold War at the time, and there was a fear that World War III would start because of Berlin, in fact. So it's a very interesting Cold War spy thriller, and that's all written. We're beginning to cast it, looking for our British spy, and I think, knock on wood, we'll film it in Prague next year. So those are the 2 hottest ones, but there are any number of other projects, including an 8-hour version of The Blue Afternoon, which is in development. Lots of things in development, but Cork and Spy City, I hope, will be the next things that are made.